Okay, now one thing that needs to be stated here is that market revolution is going to have a profound effect leading to change in the North, much more so than the South. Hopefully, it's obvious to you why this is the case. In the South, there's primarily plantation economics in place. It's utilizing slave labor. Right, this is not the modern economy or economic system that we associate with industrialization. Right, it's still in the South profoundly agrarian. Right, so you don't see the end of agrarianism like you see, or pure agrarianism, right, that you see in the North. Right. Okay, so I'm not saying that the South is left untouched by the market revolution, but certainly it's not as affected. In fact, it's not even close to what happens in the North. So let's look at what happens in the North. These are profound changes that happen in not just the United States, but many other countries that go through their own industrial revolution, right? Whether in France or England, or even today, let's say in China, right? That they're still going through their industrialization phase, and much of the stuff is happening there, or has been happening in the last 3 decades or so. In any case, in the United States, during this period, we see the transition of that small family farm, which we mentioned is subsistence plus farming. You just farm, what's necessary plus a little extra to sell in the market, so you could, have some extra earnings. That's called, again, subsistence plus farming. And then you also practice mixed agriculture, meaning you don't just plant one thing, right? You have to plant a variety. That's, you know, um, diversified farming. Why? Because you have to feed your family a variety of crops. So if you're selling just one thing, like in the South, like growing just one thing, like tobacco, obviously that is grown specifically for the market. First of all, you can't even eat tobacco, right? And secondly, you're just growing tobacco and that's it. Okay, and the aim there is to grow it to sell in the market, right? Now, in the North, you don't have the same system. So, with the advent of the market revolution, you see the small family farm meet its demise. It's starting to die, right? And sure, of course, there's still farming around, just like there's farming around today. But what happens is big business takes over farming, right? And just like today, where you have these giant corporations that own and make and sell the food we eat. In fact, many of us don't like that. Hence, we try to find organic food, so to speak. But back then, here's where you see the beginning of agribusiness. Agribusiness is basically agriculture as biz, big business, right? The commercialization of the food we eat, right, to sell on the market. So that's agribusiness, and here's when it starts developing during the market revolution. Now, with the demise of the small family farm, you start to see, especially sons, no longer counting on inheriting land. So, what you to do? You either move west, maybe, to try to find land there, or you can migrate to the city, the industrial city, and get a factory job there. Okay, so this is that migration from the rural areas to the urban areas, and this is happening in large scale by the 1850s, 60s, or American, industrial revolution. But even it begins here with the market revolution, starting in the 1830s or so. And as I mentioned earlier in the previous slide, you had the formation of a new social class of factory workers, right? We call this the working class. Now, today we use that term differently to denote those workers who work in, you know, working class, where it's just, not really, let's say the world of finance or real estate, right? You're working class. Well, back then it was very specific. It meant factory labor. Okay, that's what it means, the working class. And moreover, you see the change in the nature of labor in the factory. Okay. First of all, as I mentioned, labor is sold as a commodity by the working class to the factory owners. When you accept a job, you're being paid a wage. That's a commodity, right? But you are selling something else for that commodity of a wage. You're selling your labor power. So it's exchange of commodities, just like any exchange of commodities we see today, right? So whenever you get a job, it's important to remember that you're exchanging your commodified labor ability to your employer in exchange for a salary or a wage. Okay, so here is something new that's that's happening here, right? That is to say, the change in the way labor is being thought of in the modern economics setting. And even things like this. In a factory, you don't own the products of your labor. Who owns the things that you're making in a factory if you're a working class? The factory owner, right? Now, it's so obvious that this is the case today, but back then, you have to remember, if you made something with your own two hands, it belonged to you. Okay, in fact, you had philosophers like John Locke coming up with elaborate philosophical treatises that basically justified, let's say, ownership of land because you work on it, right? That land belongs to you because you worked on it. Or that home belongs to you because you built it with your own two hands. Now you're building something or, creating something with your own two hands in a factory setting, but it doesn't belong to you, right? It belongs to the factory owner. So even that simple and even today obvious fact is something new back then. Okay, so these are the changes that are happening here in the North. Now, it's important to note here that factory workers did not make a lot of money. They were paid peanuts. In fact, they were paid below subsistence, very low wages. Okay, why? Because there's no labor laws yet. Today we have minimum wage and all this stuff. Back then, as the system is very new and just coming into place, there is no laws whatsoever, let alone, workers' rights. Right? Things we depend on today, like not only minimum wage, but breaks and even summer vacation, right? All this stuff. Healthcare, none of that whatsoever. The employer, the factory owner, could pay you as low as he wants. Okay, but if you're desperate to survive because the farms are disappearing, you might have no choice but to take it, right? But you're going to see resistance to that. And one of the first cases of resistance to exploitation within the factory gates is the famous Lowell factory girls. In the 1830s, you see here in Massachusetts and New England, the beginning of factories, right? And some of the first factories in the United States emerged precisely in this location, right? And in this case, these were garment industries where they made, clothes and stuff. And most of the factory owners here, when they thought about who should we hire for these factory workers, well, they said, let's hire young women, okay, because we could exploit them better, right? So they went on to form this labor force of young women. And eventually, it was kind of a double-edged sword, meaning that, there was a good side and bad side. Well, the bad side is obviously they have no workers' rights, right? And they're being paid very low. So there's labor exploitation happening, committed by the factory owners. But if there's a positive side to this, it's because they gained some kind of independence from the farm, the agrarian, patriarchal household and family, right? Independence from the farm. Economic independence even, because they're making their own money, right? And, historians talk about the sisterhood that developed among the factory girls here because they were in these dormitories. They all lived together in the factory dormitories. But what happens here is they begin to protest against their own their exploitation that was happening, or that was, excuse me, committed towards them, right? Not paying them wages, locking them up, unsafe, locking them up in a factory, right? Unsafe work conditions. So they're known as one of the first, and we have the term, right? Unions, right? Now, they weren't a union, technically speaking, right? As we know today, but here's one of the first efforts, right, to get together and in solidarity and to protest and to really fight the capitalist in for their own rights, right, for their freedoms and rights, right, the freedom to have a decent wage, more safer work conditions, so on and so forth. So they actually accomplished this. And this is the well-known factory girls in Lowell and Waltham. This right here, Waltham. Okay, the Lowell factory girls. Now let's go back and focus on that that household, right? That family household that's no longer agrarian. Okay, so as we just described the previous discussion, well, you have the decline of the family farm. The typical family farm had a lot of, children because they needed that labor. Well, that became more of a liability now, and you have your, family here in the household, but it's still patriarchal, right? In the industrial setting, but it's not as patriarchal as the agrarian one. But what you see happening is its effect on gender and family. Okay, for one, you see something called the doctrine of separate spheres that emerges during the market revolution and taking place, especially as getting away from the agrarian sort of setting and being part of the industrial setting. So how does that apply to the family and the household? Well, as suggested in the term, you have the home being composed of two separate spheres or domains, and it's based on gender. And here's how it worked: the man was assumed to be the stronger gender or sex, so therefore, it's his responsibility to go out there in the cutthroat world of business and commerce and the industrial world to compete with others in that cutthroat world, competitive world. And that's his domain, away from the home, right? And then the women, on the other hand, since they were thought to be the inferior sex and less capable and even intellectually inferior was assumed back then. Well, they belonged in the home. In fact, this connects to cult of domesticity, because the cult of domesticity preached that women were the natural domestic of the genders, right? They're naturally domestic. What do we mean? Cleaning, cooking, raising children, all that stuff. Okay. Men, on the other hand, they're less inclined towards that. So what's happening here is the division of the home into, well, it's not literally the home belonging to women, but it's their exclusive preserve, if you will, in terms of where they belonged, right? Women were relegated to the home. They can't go out there and work, right? Let alone politics and vote. No, they belong in a home. And they should be involved in domestic activities like cleaning and cooking and child rearing. Men, on the other hand, must go out there and compete outside the home. So this led to the separate spheres. And this will be really the prevalent ideology all the way until, let's say, the 1950s and 60s. In fact, if you watch the older movies or television shows or black and white, you'll see the housewife, and then you'll see the husband come home and say, honey, I'm home, fix me a drink, right? All that stuff is a result of the separate spheres ideology or doctrine and the cult of domesticity.